Well, welcome to the whole of ecosystem approach session, how tech platforms identify, address, and prevent violent extremist content. Just wanted to make sure everybody was in the right room. My name is Bob Shear. I'm the Executive Director of the Allegheny Intermediate Unit, an educational services agency here in the Pittsburgh region, and also a member of the steering committee and a lifelong Pittsburgher. So if you've been in any of my other sessions, I'm always proud of that because I love to see how our community comes together when really there is a need, and I think this is a great example. So a couple of housekeeping items. You've heard this probably multiple times in all the sessions you've attended, but to my left and to my right, you see some QR codes where you're able to ask questions in real time. Our moderator for this session is actually online, so you'll be meeting her in just a moment. But we have one of our members on the panel who's willing to, well, actually, he kind of lost a bet outside, yeah, if you didn't see that. But he wasn't quick enough to get his finger to his nose. So he'll be taking those questions and addressing them or passing them along to Dina here in just a moment. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being part of this summit. This is our last track session of the day. And then afterwards, we'll be moving back in for the final keynote in the main ballroom. So at this time, I would like to introduce Dina Hussain from Meta. And you probably saw her in some other earlier sessions as well if you've been in this room. So Dina, I will turn it over to you right now. I can't see you. I can see you on the screen now. So thank you so much for being here. And I turn it over to you right now.
Thanks, Bob. And thanks to Justin, who's behind all the tech, for helping me be the quote-unquote voice of God on the screen at this moment in time. Thank you all for coming to our panel. Again, I am so sorry that I can't be there in person, but I know that our esteemed speakers today are more than going to make up for it. As Bob mentioned, our conversation today is really meant to touch on the whole of ecosystem approach that I think we're all actively moving towards when it comes to addressing violent and terrorist extremist content, terrorist and violent extremist content online. And we've got a really excellent selection of folks on the stage today that really cover a spectrum of the kinds of partnerships and stakeholders involved in addressing this kind of content. So I'm going to start off by asking a few questions, and I'm going to also ask Nick, Vidya, Karina, and Tom to introduce themselves as they go in to answer their first questions. Again, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Dina Hussain. I head up our global policy development and partnership work at Meta. So to begin with, I really wanted to touch on the existing state of play and then move us towards the challenges we're addressing and finally talk through some of the solutions that we're hoping to propose. And to start us off, I'm going to pull in my partner in crime, Nick, who also represents the tech industry, because I'd really love to talk through what the current state of play is in the way that tech companies remove violating content. And I would love it, Nick, if you could touch on the areas where you see space for us to move beyond the binary of either keeping up content or taking down content.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Dina. Sorry not to be able to meet you in person, but thanks for moderating. And yeah, my name's Nick Bauer. I work in the Government Affairs and Public Policy Department at Google. I'm based in San Francisco, and I work on issues related to hate speech and extremism and terrorism. Wanted to say how pleased I am to be able to attend this conference. It's first such conference I've attended, and I think it's great for tech companies to be able to hear from the real experts, the researchers and folks in civil society who are spending their whole careers investigating these issues. And I think it's great that if tech companies can take back some of these learnings, and I'll try to do that. I've also really appreciated how this conference has raised up the voices of survivors of many of the attacks we've sadly seen, so I really appreciated that. In terms of Google's approach in this area, our mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And we want to make sure that we're serving the needs of our users and giving them useful information. And we think about it in terms of 4 R's. So the first is remove, and I think it's great to go beyond the binary of remove and not remove, but we have made significant progress on that remove pillar. We have over 20,000 people around the world working to address content that violates our policies on violent extremism and hate speech and other abuse areas. We use a combination of machine systems, automated systems, and human review of user flags to address this, and we're transparent about our progress in quarterly reports on YouTube that we put out. For example, in Q2, we removed 4.5 million videos from YouTube. 93% of those were first flagged by machines as opposed to user flags, and of those, about a third were removed before they had any views at all, a third between 1 and 10 views. And another little progress point on that is something called violative view rate, where we look at what percentage of views were of violative content. So it's about between 9 and 11 out of 10,000 views were people viewing content that went on to violate our policies and was removed. So that's removal and some of the progress we've made there. The second is raise. So that's really about making quality count in our ranking systems and recommendations, and also where we prominently feature content. So an example of that would be on search. We really want to make sure we're looking at the expertise, authoritativeness, and trustworthiness of pages, especially when it's on something sensitive like what we call your money or your life, or a news-related query. So we have, I think hundreds of thousands of updates to our ranking algorithm every year. And we have a network of folks around the world who rely on a publicly available set of guidelines called the Search Quality Rater Guidelines. That's over 100 pages. Anyone can take a look at it online. We also released a condensed version of it. And it talks about what we mean by expertise, authoritative, and trustworthiness, and examples of that. And then the third is reduce. So a lot of that is about reducing the spread of borderline content, or content that just goes right up to the edge of what violates our policies. So on YouTube, we've made changes in our recommendation systems that have resulted in a 70% drop in recommendations of borderline content. And we aim to keep the prevalence of that around 0.5%. Finally, is reward. So that means setting a high bar for monetization, making sure monetization is a privilege on things like AdSense, where if you're a website operator, and there's been cases before of websites that have peddled misinformation for monetary gain, and we want to make sure we're removing those. Also, YouTube creators are able to earn revenue, and we want to make sure we're setting an even higher bar in terms of preventing bad actors from monetizing content for that gain. So that's a little bit about sort of our approach, and I'm also happy to sort of delve into these questions about partnerships and where we go from here, and what we're doing in the future, including with folks around this table. Thanks.
Thanks, Nick. That was a really great cross-section of the kind of work that's being done by industry. And so I think it was a really good place to start. And so understanding the kind of work that you've been doing, I'd like to hand over to Vidya to talk us through a little about the work that Moonshot has been doing in assessing the effectiveness of all of the work that tech companies are putting into this kind of removal has been really impressive. And that's why a lot of us at the table have partnered with Moonshot to utilize your expertise and your team's knowledge around this kind of work. So I'd be keen to hear from you. What should we be looking at when we're considering steps beyond just that binary of removing or leaving up content? And how best can we develop tools that really address these kinds of efforts effectively, transparently, and with equity in mind?
Sure, thanks, Dina. Hi, everyone. My name is Vidya. I'm founder and CEO of Moonshot. First of all, thank you all for joining us on the final session of the final day of the event. I've been lovingly calling this shift the graveyard shift, and I would have been very happy if 3 people would have turned up to this session. So I'm really pleased that we have a really nice group here. So Moonshot's work with the tech companies, we actually don't do a huge amount of work with the tech companies on moderation. And that's not because it's an absolutely critical issue. It is, and the tech companies need to do far more than they're currently doing, my own personal opinion, on content moderation. But content moderation on its own is not enough when it comes to actually stemming the impact and the flow of hate speech and extremism on platforms. And that's for a few reasons. The way I usually describe this is we can remove a post or a comment or a user from a platform, but if you delete that user, that person isn't deleted. The person still exists in the world around us and will either just migrate to another platform or continue to try and post on that same platform, or might remain a threat or a risk in the community around us. So our question is, in addition to moderation efforts that the tech companies absolutely need to pursue, what else can be done to make experiences on tech platforms more safe and to encourage safer behaviors from individuals that are on them? So our approach is really to think about every single stage in a user journey on a platform and to try and take every opportunity in that journey to try and make it a safer environment and to try and steer people in a safer direction if they're going down a dangerous path. And in order to do this, I kind of think about it in three layers here. I think about it on the one hand, so very first side of the spectrum is community awareness. And this is really just thinking about the wider community that are on these platforms who may not be actively engaging with extremist or hate content. They have no interest in engaging with it, and that might include many people in this room, but who might accidentally or unintentionally be coming across content that might fall into a gray zone, and that might be disinformation content. It might be a range of different harmful types of content. So community awareness initiatives are really important, and that's something that we support tech companies in testing and piloting on their platforms. How can we actually flag content which may not actually have been, I guess maybe a good example of this is Twitter recently introduced a feature on platform where they flag when you are retweeting a piece of content that you haven't actually opened the link yourself. So it's basically a community awareness initiative that allows individuals or enables individuals to know when actually they might be passing on information that they don't actually really know what's contained within it. The second kind of layer here is when the audience that we're thinking about is audiences who are actively seeking or engaging hate content. So this is not the wider public or people unintentionally engaging with this, but people who have an active interest and would like to engage in hate or harmful content. And for that audience, what we do with tech platforms is to try and think about how we can redirect and safeguard users, redirect users towards safer alternatives. The most kind of prominent example of this, and some of you may have heard of our work on this with the tech companies, is called the redirect method. This was something that we first piloted with Google back in 2015, 2016, I think it was. And it actually used commercial advertising. So the idea was, how can we repurpose commercial advertising to ensure there's a safer alternative available to someone who is actively searching for hate content or extremist content on platform. Now, using advertising is really limiting. It's not always, first of all, it costs us money, and not every tech platform is willing to pay us money to run ads on their platforms to do this. So what we've been doing more recently with tech companies is working with them on how we can actually build that same mechanism into the design of the platform itself. And this is something that we worked recently with Meta on. In 2019, we worked with Meta on both the design and evaluation of Facebook's first in-platform redirection for white supremacy searches. So on Facebook, if any of you use Facebook, there's a search function at the top, a search bar at the top of the website. And if you enter in a white supremacist search term, you will now, because of this initiative that Facebook launched, you will now be offered safer alternatives rather than it directing you to anything related to what you're searching for, which may or may not even exist on the platform. And the idea was to try and reach users, even if they're not posting harmful content, if they're seeking it, how can we actually reach users and direct them into a safer alternative? We had really promising results from that first program. It was done in partnership with Life After Hate, which some of you might have seen Life After Hate on some of the panels here at the summit. So the idea was to actually connect users who are actively seeking white supremacy content in with a service that could work with them in the long run. Based on some of the promising findings from that pilot, that model has now, as of 2022, been expanded. It now covers not only white supremacist ideology, but other forms of extremist ideology. And it's now live in the US, in the UK, in Germany, in Pakistan, in Indonesia, across the world. And so this is something that we'll continue to evaluate with Meta. The first evaluation report from that first pilot is in the public domain, and I'm happy to share the link with any of you that are interested. And then the evaluations for the expansion of that work will be put in the public domain in the next few months and years. The third layer, so I talked about community awareness and then redirection for people actively seeking or engaging hate content. The third layer is deplatforming. So this is for audiences that have crossed the line. They've already violated the terms of service and the expectations on these platforms, the community standards. And so for us, the question is not just how do we get people off the platform? The question for us is, well, what are we trying to achieve with deplatforming? If deplatforming is actually trying to achieve, the kind of overarching objective of making these platforms safer in the end, are we truly achieving that by just removing a person off the platform with little engagement with them as we do so? And so we've been thinking more and more about how tech companies do deplatforming and whether when we deplatform users, whether that in its own right is a moment where we can intervene. And I have a few more thoughts to share on that, Dina, but I think we might come back to deplatforming, so let's go on to others.
Thanks, Vidya. Way to tease everybody with that. So I'm going to hand over to a few of our partners. So we've started with what the tech companies do around the removal of this content and beyond that slightly. And Vidya has very astutely and eloquently outlined where our partners from the expert side then add in their expertise around either the portions in a preventative manner, so beforehand, or in the aftermath. But I think as we consider the whole of ecosystem, I'd love to hand over to Tom and then to Corinna to talk through, first of all, when we're seeing that the large platforms are effectively removing actors or content off their platforms, there is an outcome, and that is that those actors and those pieces of content then get moved somewhere else, to Vidya's point. And I'd love to hear from Tom, especially, what is it that the tech platforms can be doing to ensure that there is some sort of support through the stakeholder community around addressing what happens when these users and this content jumps? Thank you, Dina. And just thank you to everybody from the conference for attending and showing up still at the end of the day. It's a real honor to be here today, and I very much enjoyed all of the other panels leading up to today, so to this one today, so thank you. I'm Tom Thorley. I'm the Director of Technology from GiftCT. We're a non-profit founded and funded by the tech companies, and including Meta and YouTube. And we have 19 tech company members now, including Clubhouse, who just recently joined. So we're really excited to have them on board. If you look at our member companies, those 19 companies, you'll see a range of different companies, from the massive companies that we have represented here on stage to some much, much smaller companies. And our smallest company is a company called Just Paste It, which some of you, I'm sure, being extremist researchers, will be aware of. But it's a tiny organization. It's literally one employee and not a monetized platform. So the resource picture that those different companies have is very great. Equally, lots of our companies work in very different ways. You have companies that are really focused around user-generated content, like Facebook, like YouTube, like many of our member companies. But lots of those companies also are not focused on that user-generated content. I think companies like Zoom, Airbnb, and other companies which fall somewhere in the middle or have maybe different kinds of content, like Clubhouse, for example. So with that ecosystem in mind, how do we enable those tech companies to collaborate when one has found this material, or many have found this material? How do we make sure they share that information? And I really highlight two mechanisms that we have at GiftCT to help with that, although there are other pieces of the puzzle as well. But the first is really providing context and understanding to all of those companies, all of the content moderation teams, the trust and safety teams within those companies. Many of these companies don't have counterterrorism experts on staff, and they don't have big content moderation teams where they have lots and lots of staff to deal with the different harms types.
So we have to make sure that we can provide context to them. And we do that in a range of different ways, the biggest of which is looking at our partners, GNet, the global network on extremism and terrorism, who we fund. And many of the researchers from GNet are here at this conference. They're producing insights daily, pretty much. One just came out this morning, in fact. Really trying to give context and understanding to what the latest trends are in the counterterrorism space. And they're designed to be short pieces that can be easily consumed by folks in tech companies to give them a primer into that environment and know, hey, when I'm seeing this particular type of signal or this trend, this is what the underbelly of that looks like. This is what that really means to me. And for somebody who has no context in the field, how do I moderate content in that space? So giving that context is really, really critical for those teams. In addition to that, we want to make it really easy for companies to identify that content that we already know has violated at least one of our member companies' terms of service. And we do that by using our hash sharing database. And that, for those of you who don't know about hashing, is a system by which any of our member companies can find on their platform some content. It might be an image, it might be a video, it might be a PDF. And they can say, hey, this is breached our terms of service. It's terrorist or violent extremist content of a particular type and fits within GIFCT's taxonomy. And then they can create a digital fingerprint, a hash, that relates to that particular content. And it also relates to very, very similar content, so that if it's been slightly modified or altered, we can find that similar content really quickly. That signal gets shared into GIFCT's database and made available to all of our other members, who then can take that signal, look on their platform to see where it also appears, and quickly queue that up for content moderation. Now, as Dina and Vidya said, this is not a game of always removing all of that content. The context in which that content appears is very important, and the different options that different companies have, as Nick said, they think about removal and raising and rewarding, and lots of different mechanisms that different companies have depending on what their platform does. But identifying that and queuing it up for content moderation really helps to make sure that that's quickly available, at least the known really bad stuff that we've already had one pair of eyes on can get out there quickly. So that work is ongoing, and we're working on expanding that to look at hashing of URLs, which really will help with, there's a phenomenon where actually a lot of the terrorist content isn't posted on the mainstream platforms anymore. It's posted on smaller platforms. We were joking in the break before the meeting, this session, that we should have some kind of drinking game or a kind of bet on how many times somebody's going to mention kiwi farms. But platforms like that, where material is shared and stored off the mainstream platforms and then linked back into mainstream platforms as a URL, is actually difficult to deal with. And so having sharing of those URLs, sharing of, hey, we know already that this content stored off platform is terrorist and violent extremist material, is a really important signal. And then one of the RFPs that we have out currently to tender, and we're seeking a solution to, is how we deal with audio content. Increasingly an important trend, both in the violent extremist space, but also in technology companies themselves, where more and more audio-first features are being built into platforms. Being able to hash that content and share those hashes of content as a signal is really important. And there's lots of nuance to that, as you can imagine, that there is violent extremist content that is actually speech, human speech, and there's also things like violent extremist music, believe it or not, in all different ideologies, actually, that needs to be moderated. And the technology to quickly identify that, hash it, and share it needs to be matured. So we're rapidly working on doing that as well. In closing, I just said that the final area that I'd like to highlight is really working groups that GIFCT run. And these are multi-sectoral groups that we bring together with tech companies, governments, and academia, all of which are designed to answer some of these really difficult questions around how we have transparency around these processes, how we have the right definitions so that we know what should we include as terrorism and violent extremism, and how we deal with crisis. Those working groups are just about to be reopened. In fact, they launched yesterday, the application process. And if you're interested in contributing to those working groups and those discussions, please come and talk to me afterwards, and I can make sure that you have the right links and application forms for that process. Dina, thank you.
Thanks, Tom. That was a really useful overview, I think. And I'm very conscious of time, so I really want to hear from Karina, who has heard all of this, understands the really complex way in which all of these different jigsaw parts come together. And so, Karina, I'd love to get your thoughts on how can we very effectively work with other members of the stakeholder community, civil society, other tech adjacent platforms to make sure that whatever actions we take, whether they be prevention, removal, binary responses, that there is an understanding of the impact and the effectiveness and also the wider ripple effects. So I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dina. And first, I'd like to thank everyone for being here and to my fellow panelists for speaking before me and giving some really insightful comments. I'll start off with an introduction of myself and where I come from. I'm a researcher with Pure Technologies, which is a threat intelligence company. And what does that mean? We have a variety of algorithms and advanced machine learning tools to detect various content that we see on the web. And specifically, we look at these fringe online platforms. So you think Kiwi Farms, you think 4chan, you think Gab, and all these other things that jump to mind. The ethos there is that we have seen people and extremists going to these niche platforms if and when they get deplatformed, moderated off of the more mainstream platforms where they're able to get a following, a more mainstream following. So we do three things. We collect this content. We use these algorithms to detect certain kinds of violence, hate speech, and disinformation that pops up regularly. And then we display that information for our clients, either through reports that we create or through a direct platform that they're able to access. So I think throughout this panel and throughout this conference, we've established one of the wicked problems that we're dealing with, which is because of the way the internet is set up, it's very hard to stop content from spreading and to get rid of it entirely. It's like the old adage, you can't kill an idea. That's very true with the internet. It's always going to be somewhere that is very hard to reach, even as you try to chase it from platform to platform. And because content jumps so easily, and one reason actually that I think this is a conversation now, is that I do think there have been many developments in recent years from big tech companies taking further action on deplatforming, on content moderation, and instituting these policies. Even though there could be more work done, there have been big strides that have been taken. And the trends that we have seen in response to that is this influx of the popularity of small social media sites growing, and even the creation of some sites in response to the supposed suppression of free speech that some on the far right associate with content moderation and deplatforming. That's where you see things like Truth Social and Getter and things like that. So harmful content can jump from these mainstream platforms to alternative social media platforms when content moderation happens. And a good example of this is, for many years, a popular community for incels and voluntary celibates existed on Reddit. Reddit ended up deplatforming them in 2017, and nowadays that community is still very much thriving. They just, for the most part, don't thrive on Reddit. They have created several different forums and specific communities to house their ideas and their conversation and their violent thoughts, essentially. So basically, yes, there's a symbiotic relationship between the big platforms and the small fringe platforms that also Tom referenced earlier, that because of all these places on the internet that you can host content and host forums, conversations, thoughts, cross-posting allows you to import that content really easily to different kinds of platforms. So even if folks have been, for the most part, deplatformed on the big sites, they can always probably create a new user profile, or other folks in their network could jump in. Some may be more anonymous than others, and post some of this content that is being hosted on alternative sites. And so this cross-posting relationship is one that we see a whole lot. And so with this current set of societal and tech tools, I think it's important to recognize that we can't kill these hateful ideas right now. I think that it's the long-term goal, of course, but I think at this point in time, as we've been discussing on this panel, it's very important to focus on sort of the discrete tactics that are focused on limiting the reach of this violent and extremist content, and especially making it harder for the most folks to access this kind of content, and redirecting them when they do. At Pura, we believe that the most important first step is collecting the information and knowing what you're dealing with. Because once deplatforming on mainstream platforms happens, it does become a bit harder for the research community, for journalists to find a way to collect all of the information and the conversations that are happening on these sort of more hard to access platforms. There are even things like Discus, which can usually be in comment sections where some of these communities are evolving in real time, and that can be very difficult to collect that information, just given the construction of that platform. So that's where some tools like Pura can come in, algorithms that can pull this information and put it in a more digestible format for both humans to look at and to analyze, and then also for other tech tools to come in and to help process it. So Pura and other algorithm tools like this, we try to give researchers and investigators a better understanding of what is going on in these fringe platforms after folks have been deplatformed from the more mainstream outlets. So that's one thing that we try to do. And then I think overall, it is also important to look at the whole ecosystem, of course, the point of this panel. But you think about the different areas where certain interventions may be able to be taken at each step of the way. So something like Kiwi Farms, of course, there was the recent issue of the service provider where there was a big public campaign and a push for it to be for it to drop Kiwi Farms, essentially. So that's one area of public pressure that can be pushed on, and other things like advertising. I think there needs to be a greater creativity and tactics that need to be taken more than just the deplatforming and the content moderation, because it's only one part of the problem. I think with that, I'll pass it back to you, Dina.
Thanks so much, Karina. I appreciate it. So again, we don't have very much time, so I'm going to open up for a couple of questions. Whoever the cheeky person was that didn't touch their nose fast enough, maybe I'll let it hand over to you, Tom.
That was me, Dina. I don't have any questions yet on the iPad, but maybe while we wait for questions, I could just jump in and pick up on one or 2 points that the other panelists have made. I think Katrina closed with a very important point, which is we do need to think holistically about the tools and the tactics that we're using. And I think not focusing just on content moderation is a really good lens to think through. Terrorists are using pretty much every application you can think of online, terrorists and violent extremists. But they are regular human beings just like you and I. They use every app on the phone that you would have. I was recently at a workshop in Ghana, and we asked the participants there to stand up if they had a certain number of apps on their phone, and we figured the average number of apps on somebody's phone in that room was between 40 and 60 apps. Terrorists are the same. They're not using one platform. They're not just using it to push content. They're using it for every different reason that you would use the internet. They're using financing. They're using it for communications. They're using it for logistics. They're using it for planning purposes, for accommodation. Everything that you would use the internet for, they are using it for. And we need to be thinking about what are the tactics, what are the tools that we can use to address all of those range of problems, not just kind of hitting the symptom of content. And I think the other lens that I'd like to bring to that conversation is that while we do that, we need to be really thoughtful about human rights. Actually, all of this work that we're doing, whether it's content moderation, whether it's prevention work, we're trying to balance different human rights. We're trying to make sure that we're actually decreasing the risk of impinging the right to freedom, the right to security, the right to life, and the security of person. We're trying to really make sure we're underpinning that and supporting it. But we don't want to give away our rights to privacy, to freedom of expression, to freedom of assembly while we're doing that. And we're needing to optimize across this really complex system. So I think we need to think creatively, but we also need to be really mindful about those human rights.
I think that's a really fair point, Tom. And to actually jump off of that very quickly, part of the discussions that we've been having have really thus far been between tech companies, their experts, and we're seeing that now, especially through partnerships like the partnership with Moonshot, the partnership with the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, voices from civil society and legal experts and conversations around the legal frameworks that need to be in place to protect the very rights that you're highlighting. And this is a conversation that we had in one of the working groups that Tom mentioned at the GIFCT. It's become more of a practice that we're really emphasizing across the board. But it's a very good flag, and I think it's one to keep in mind, I think, for future conversations here at the Eradicate Hate Summit, because we've had a conversation across the board about that very, very delicate balance that we are striking between removals and understanding that there is user privacy and freedom of speech concerns that I think every single one of our panelists have mentioned today. So I appreciate that, and I think it's a really important flag. So I will do one last check on questions, and if there aren't any, I will wrap this up.
There
Tom,
is one question that just came in, which says, does the legal action by Texas and others to prevent content moderation have the potential to limit the removal of dangerous content?
I will open it up for any of the panelists if they want to jump in.
A bit cautious about commenting on ongoing litigation. That ruling came out a couple of days ago, and there have been some good, I think, takes from the academic and civil society community. I think Eric Goldman at Santa Clara University had a good blog post on that. Mike Masnick from Tech Dirt, I guess more journalism, wrote up, I think, some information on that. Definitely some legal issues to be worked out there in terms of First Amendment and how it applies to the online space, but a little bit hesitant to go into too much detail on that, given.
I think one thing that I would say, I don't know the specifics of the case, and I'm certainly not a legal expert, but what I have observed is that legislation that is being produced at the moment can often be in conflict with other legislation in other jurisdictions. And many of our companies, if not all of the members of GIFCT, operate in a global way. Users are spread around the globe and operate in different jurisdictions. And it makes it really difficult for tech companies and for everyday citizens to be mindful of what the laws are and how they interact with each other. But if you have one place where a law is mandating a piece of content may be kept up and cannot be moderated, and another place that's mandating removal of that same piece of content within 24 hours or 48 hours or whatever the time frame that's put on it is, that makes it a really difficult position to put the companies who are trying to work through these problems in. And I think policymakers need to be really mindful of that issue as they go forward.
Yeah. Thanks, Tom. I think I'm aware that we do have to let people go and we have to relieve them of the clutches that we have on them at this point in time. But to just wrap up, I know that the Fifth Circuit opinion that came out is one that's top of mind for everybody in the US, but I will highlight that to add to the points being made by Nick and Tom, we're also seeing that laws and legislations and frameworks that are being put into place from a legal perspective are being pulled and repeated in other countries where the rule of law might not be as strong as we see it in what we deem a democratic country. And I think you will hear this time and time again, that when governments and legislative bodies are writing these kinds of laws, it would behoove all of us to consider how there might be a replication of this globally that might not be applied in the democratic manner that we hope and hold our legislative colleagues accountable for here in places like the UK where I am and the US where all the other folks are. So with that very controversial
Could I piggyback on that really quickly, since I think we do have a little bit more time. I didn't share that much detail about my background, but I've been at Google 8 years, and the last 4, I just started this role in February. The last 4.5 years before that, I was covering South and Southeast Asia. So some experience in government affairs and content regulation in countries that don't uphold the same democratic norms that we all adhere to here in this conference. So I can just attest firsthand. I've been in many, many conversations with regulators where they are taking very well-intentioned regulatory efforts out of context. I would also just highlight on regulation, when it's really important for us to talk about impacts on smaller platforms of regulation. At the same time, a lot of these regulations have been targeted at larger companies, which is appropriate in a way, because we deserve a lot of scrutiny given our size and scale. However, when we're talking about some of these smaller fringe platforms where maybe they aren't willing to, either there might be a resourcing issue, but there also is oftentimes they're not willing to come to the table. And then the question is, how does regulation address that? And if you're only focusing on the top 3 largest platforms, how does that get to the problem we've been discussing about fringe platforms that are intentionally spreading this horrific content? So just a couple pieces to think about there.
And Dina, the timer up here is telling us that we have 17 minutes more. So I don't.
I'm going to ask the voice of the beings up top. Justin, are we good on time?
I got a thumbs
we got
up.
a thumbs up.
Thumbs up.
We got a thumbs up. Okay, great.
We saw
Then
a thumb
with that,
emerge from the the equipment.
It's the voice of God and the thumbs of God. Who knows?
There is another question in the list
Go
now
for
if you
it.
want that.
Go
Dina.
for it. This is
It's quite a broad
excellent.
question, honestly, but it says, can we ever truly eradicate hate?
Whoa. I mean, I think I can take a stab at a portion of this. The entire idea of this panel, when we initially started to think about bringing this group of experts together, was to really look at what is the most impact we could have on harmful content that looks beyond the way that we've just been doing things in a silo. So I remember in the prep call with the panelists, we talked about how do we look at cross abuse pillars. So how do we look at how violent extremists interact with misinformation and disinformation and health misinformation? This kind of intersection is really fascinating to us. And then beyond just the intersections of topics, we also want to understand, are there tools here and are there portions in the life cycle of abusive behavior that we can address a little earlier on? So just to reiterate, we've talked about prevention and we've talked about removal, and we've talked about in the aftermath of removal, ensuring that other platforms and other areas where this could be impactful are also being supported and addressed. And we've talked about the downstream impact on legal frameworks. And so, not to be the pessimist, but I don't think there is ever going to be a silver bullet. But in bringing together these kinds of conversations, maybe I am a optimistic and naive person, as well as being sometimes pessimistic. But I think these are the avenues and these are the conversations that will help get us to most amount of impact. But I'd be keen to hear from Vidya and Corinna as well.
Yeah, I'll jump in here quickly and just say that I think that I share your view, Dina. There's not a silver bullet from my perspective as a researcher in this space. I do think that what we have seen with technology and the way that technology is moving, that there are technological tools and platforms and tactics essentially that can make this aspect of human nature a lot worse, and there are tools that can make it a lot better. And I think that we're still finessing some of the improvements to those tools. But I don't know. I think it's one of the keys is identifying what in human nature is made worse, what kind of hatred is brought out, and what like the worst characteristics of our humanity is made worse by these certain kinds of algorithms and targeted content and gamification that can occasionally, if not spark hatred, stoke hatred and stoke negative content. So there's that, and then I think we're still investigating how to make people better with technology.
I might add to that, Dina. I said yesterday, and I've had a few conversations now with folks in the kind of hallways, I think we need to get out of the binary of optimism, pessimism here. We have agency. Like, there are things we can do, and we have an evidence base. Violence prevention works, and there is a vast evidence base, not just in America, but also abroad, and in European countries that in many ways have had experiences that are not dissimilar to what America has experienced. There is an evidence base to show us that violence prevention works, and there is increasing evidence to show that you can do violence prevention online. And so I mentioned yesterday, like, I am hopeful, and I think like hope is a slightly different thing from pessimism, optimism. But as I was thinking about it since yesterday, I thought actually it's kind of evidence-based hope, right? It's not like hope with a finger in the air, let's see which way the wind blows. Like, there's an evidence base here that we can build off of. And one thing I wanted to say on the conversation about deplatforming and individuals moving to niche platforms, there's a question that I think our field needs to address as we talk about content moderation and deplatforming, and is deplatforming actually achieving what we need it to achieve? If the ultimate objective here, and I'm going to actually talk for a second not about objectives for the tech companies, because there are commercial objectives that the tech companies have that the wider society won't have. If the ultimate objective is to create a safer community and to mitigate the possibility of violence, are we actually achieving that through deplatforming? And I don't think we really have, speaking of evidence, I don't think we have enough evidence to show that the way we're doing deplatforming right now is ultimately having the impact we need it to have. And for all of the reasons that Corinna raised around individuals migrating to niche platforms, we recently did a piece of work with a tech company to investigate. Basically, we were asking ourselves the question, is deplatforming working? Now, we were looking at objectives for the tech company, which again are different than the objectives of society. But if their objectives are, they want to retain users on platform because that helps them make more money, right? So keeping users on platform is actually a good thing for the tech companies. They also want to make their platform safer. And if they want to contribute to reducing cross-platform levels of toxicity, we basically were asking the question, is it working? And so we actually did qualitative research. We went out and interviewed people who had been deplatformed, and we also looked at their user journeys, where they went once they were deplatformed. And we found that in addition to, we did gather evidence on some of the things Corinna mentioned, that deplatformed individuals go to alternative niche harmful platforms. We also found that when they went to those platforms, the toxicity of the content that they posted increased, so it made them even more extreme. But then really interesting on an individual level, what we found is that it was really the effect of deplatforming was really harmful for them. They wanted to stay on the platform. It was their community, their friends, sometimes their family. And so it left them with a feeling of social isolation, feeling alone, feeling like that they had lost a really important part of their social network. And that really struck us because we thought, okay, if people who were deplatformed want to stay on platform, and if the tech companies want to keep them on platform, but we need them to behave in a safer way and not be as toxic, is there a way that we can achieve that, achieve something that actually all parties here want? And so the question that I think we need to ask ourselves as we continue to build on content moderation and deplatforming is this an opportunity for intervention? Is this an opportunity to start to educate users when they get deplatformed such that we can bring them back and they can actually act in a safer way? And it'll take some experimentation for us to actually build an evidence base to show that that could work. But that's something that we're looking to do next is basically, when we deplatform a user, is there an opportunity for us to give them as much information as possible on why they were deplatformed, as much information and resources as possible to help educate them on how to be a safer member of the community and how to stay on platform, and then give them a chance to come back and have a kind of measured way of actually keeping them on platform and ensuring that they're becoming safer members of the community. In addition to that, is it an opportunity for us, coming back to that social isolation piece, to actually connect them in with resources, with organizations that can support them, that can engage with them if actually they've just lost their entire social community. So I do want us to think about even some of these, content moderation and deplatforming seems it's non-controversial for any of us. We know it needs to happen, but how do we actually ensure that that's creating a safer environment for all of us and limiting the potential for violence from those individuals?
I think just to add to what Vidya's saying there, I think one of the things that we really struggle with is measures of the impact and effectiveness of all of the things that we're doing, honestly, whether it's the prevention work that we're doing, the content moderation work that's being done, when we're tweaking things to raise positive interventions or making sure that less than ideal content is not rewarded. I don't think we have a really good way of measuring impact across those things and an evidence base there yet. We're doing some really good work in that space, and I think the more we can invest in making sure that as these interventions are developed, they're also funded appropriately so that they can do that measurement of impact is really important. Sometimes it feels like the work that we're doing is a bit of a Sisyphean task, and we're rolling that boulder up the hill, and then the next event happens, and it feels like we're being right back where we started. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing it, right? There is hope here. We are making progress in a lot of different ways. We are learning what things are working and what things aren't, and we're constantly iterating, and we're constantly keeping up. The only way we get to anywhere like eradicating hate, or I often think back to my time in the UK government when David Cameron, who was at the time Prime Minister, said we have to silence Daesh online. Like, sometimes these big glib statements are unhelpful, but sometimes they're a good organizing function that help us think through and be aspirational in where we're heading next. And I think we can make progress against these things. It's not a binary optimism or pessimism, but we can make forward progress, but only if we're doing that together, and only if we're really trying to think through what's the impact that we're having and how are we doing better in some places and some of these other things that we're doing, maybe we need to retire or retry different approaches to them.
Thanks, Tom. So with that, and on Vidya's optimistic note with 2 minutes to go, I really did just want to close out because we are the final panel. I just wanted to say thank you so much for everybody that's joined this conversation. And I wanted to highlight one thing. We're not just bringing together this panel of experts to talk at you. One of the things that you will have noticed is all of us know each other. We've all engaged behind the scenes, and it's due to the excellent opportunities that folks get in these collaborative spaces such as the Eradicate Hate Summit. So please, as you see these panelists leave the stage, I urge you to assault them and make sure that you're connecting with them and getting their contact information, because the only way we will be successful at continuing to evolve this approach and making sure that as the threat mutates, we evolve. Please make sure that you're reaching out, and if there is something you can offer, and if there is any engagement or support that you can provide, or an idea that you want to make sure that you're sharing, I'm going to speak on behalf of everybody on that stage, we're all really receptive to hearing it, and we all really want to engage. So with that, I want to say thank you to the excellent panelists that gave us their time and their insights, and I wish you all the best of luck with the rest of your day, and hopefully I will see you all in person next year. So thank you to everyone who attended.
Thank you, Dina.
Thanks, Dina.